have the chance to have Cyrus Mody here. Thank you, Cyrus, for coming to the center of Paris. And you are here because Marianne Noël, I mean, you are in another project than the one you are going to present here. I mean, I want to thank Marianne to give us the opportunity to hear you on your project. I didn't know about your project. As you can see and as you will see, there will be a lot of people interested in what you are doing. So Cyrus, I will let Marianne say more about his work. Cyrus Mody is an historian of science and technology, very well known for his work. I know you for many, many years on your work on nanotechnology and nanoparticles. So, but Marianne will say more about, I mean, even the work you are doing now with Marianne, and to see that this project is not the same and how broad are your research.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Cyrus. I have to improvise. So, Cyrus is professor in the history of science, technology, and innovation at Maastricht University. Yes, we met each other through the construction, the fabric of the nanobubbles project, which is funded by the European Research Council since 2021. Some colleagues are here working with Cyrus, Mady and Guillaume, and we took the opportunity to welcome him at the general seminar of the LYSIS in Marne-la-Vallée. And I think I give you the floor because it's better to hear you.
Okay, wonderful.
So you can introduce, of course, the project you are conducting now. So please, the floor is yours.
Okay, wonderful. Well, yeah, many thanks, Marianne and Swear and Jean-Baptiste and all of you for being here today. Yeah, so I'm going to present the Managing Scarcity and Sustainability project. This is a 5-year funded, 6-year total project sponsored by the Dutch Research Council. And it employs 4 people, myself, 2 PhD candidates, Jelena Stankovic and Michiel Bron, and a postdoc, Odin Melsted. We also have a few external collaborators, in particular, Simon Schleper, Tom Turnbull, and Candida Sanchez Burmester. And then we also partner with a number of external organizations, in particular, the Science History Institute, the Rachel Carson Center, the Lemelson Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation, and Rice University Center for Environmental Studies. Okay. Yeah, if you want to learn more about us or about our ongoing events, to the extent that I update it regularly, this is our website, managingscarcity.com. So, you know, for historians, it's always important for us to situate ourselves within one or more literatures with which we're in dialogue, or where we see some kind of gap, or where we think that we can knit things together. So let me go through a few of the literatures that I see as relevant to managing scarcity first, before I really dive into what we ourselves are doing. So the first is a number of fairly recent works in intellectual history and in diplomatic history that look at the role of business in discussions about politics, economics, and environment in the 1970s. So works like Stephen Massacre's Of Limits and Growth, or recent article by Glenda Sluga and some colleagues on businessmen involved in the 1972 UN Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment. You might also think of people like Quinn Slobodian's work on neoliberalism as more or less falling into this vein. Now, this is very good work, but my feeling about it is how I often feel about intellectual history, which is that it's much more about what people say than what they do. And that it's very subtle when it comes to the kind of intellectual arguments being made, but yeah, less capable of dealing with the kind of material constraints and the practicalities of what people are doing. Then there's a very rapidly growing and quite influential literature coming out of history of science, but spilling over into activism and journalism and even into the legal sphere, looking at the oil industry and allied industries such as electric utilities and their role in creating ignorance around climate change. So this is work that really kicks off with Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's book, Merchants of Doubt. But now it's spread and yeah, lots and lots of work, very compelling work, showing that, yes, indeed, oil companies and allied industries knew quite a bit about climate change by the late 1970s. Indeed, they were sponsoring some of the world's best cutting edge climate research in that period. But that at some point they shift towards a strategy of denialism, of stoking uncertainty, at least in the public sphere, about climate science. Again, I take a lot of inspiration from this work, but I have two critiques or places where I think some issues need to be addressed. One is that, a little bit as with the intellectual historians, this literature doesn't go so much into what was going on in these businesses. It's just taken for granted that these businesses had certain interests and that those interests were served by agnotology and denialism. And secondly, that there's a strange chronological gap in the narrative that this literature tells. So over and over again, these works say, yes, by 1980, oil industry knew all about climate change. After 1990, they were stoking denialism. But they don't really say anything about what happens in that intervening decade, right? Where there must have been some sort of turn from sponsoring cutting edge climate research toward sponsoring terrible climate research, right? Denialist climate research. Then there are oil historians themselves, people writing about the history of the oil industry. And to some extent, there's a very strange lack of dialogue between what oil historians are writing about and what these two other literatures have to say. Oil historians so far really haven't talked a lot about denialism. They haven't talked a lot about why oil companies were sponsoring climate research. They haven't talked that much, with some exceptions, such as Martin Bohn, about the oil industry and the environmental debates. But actually, if you look at Martin Bohn's article, it's really about the 1990s onward. Instead, the oil historians of this period are very interested in big geopolitics, OPEC, the superpower conflict and the ways that the oil industry was entangled in that. To some extent, they're interested in kind of evolving business strategies that are based on finding and exploiting new oil provinces, such as the move further and further offshore in the Gulf of Mexico or in the North Sea. But the concerns of the other literatures I've just mentioned really are not very central. Okay. There's one more factor which isn't totally absent, but is certainly marginal to all of these other literatures, and that's the history of technology, and in particular, the history of technology in the 1970s. For me, coming from where I come, that's, of course, the central topic of interest. And in fact, that's my route into an interest in oil, which is that in reading about the emerging high technologies of the 1970s, I kept running across, both in the primary sources that I was researching on my own and in the secondary sources I was reading as context. Over and over again, you would find these mentions, some new technology, and who's the big money behind this new technology? It's the oil industry, right? Over and over again. Almost always kind of just sort of mentioned and then not commented on, right? This is particularly the case in histories of microelectronics in Silicon Valley and in histories of biotechnology. You see one paragraph in an entire book that says, oh yeah, all of the money was oil money, but we're not going to comment on that, right? And somehow this needs to be explained, right? And it needs to be tied back to what's going on in these other literatures, history of science literature on oil and climate and agnotology, this intellectual and diplomatic history of oil firms and these debates about environmentalism, and of course, oil history itself, which basically ignores all of this. If you start to take this seriously, though, you notice that the oil industry, had its fingers in lots and lots of high technologies, emerging technologies of the 1970s, especially in alternative energy. So they had major programs, oil companies had major programs in nuclear fission and fusion, in solar energy, in wind, in biomass, in synfuels, in fuel cells, and advanced batteries, and on, right? So in managing scarcity, we just take a little sample of this, of what I think are the most important, the most oil subsidized alternative energy technologies of this period. So one of the PhD candidates, Michael Braun, he looks at oil and nuclear energy. That's this line here. So everywhere there's a dot, that means that there's an oil company that had a nuclear program. Then the other PhD candidate, Jelena Stankovic, she looks at oil and solar energy. So again, everywhere there's a dot, that means one of these oil companies had a solar program. Odin looks at oil and geothermal, so somewhat less involvement from the oil industry, but there you see both that some oil companies were amongst the exploiters of the largest geothermal fields in the world, but also going the other direction, that the people building the geothermal industry who weren't in the oil industry in this period, they were borrowing very heavily from knowledge and technology developed in the oil industry. So there's a kind of two-way flow. Then Odin is also looking at sort of high-tech forecasting methods, computer modeling, scenario planning, these kinds of things. And then my role in the project is partly to work with Odin to look at a circle of oil actors who were involved in global environmental governance. Talk about that later in the talk. But then also I look at oil companies and sort of advanced non-oil technologies, or technologies seemingly very unrelated to oil production, in particular microelectronics, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and nanotechnology. Okay, so really, as far as I can tell, no one has cared about these programs in all of these different technologies. Oil historians do tend to be aware of them. I mean, they're mentioned in all the annual reports of different oil companies from this period. But yeah, they don't really see it as something worth discussing, right? These weren't programs that soaked up a lot of, at least as a percentage of the budgets of these oil companies. They tend to treat the oil industry as an oil industry and not to expand their focus to all of these non-oil technologies. Intellectual historians, I think, tend not to care about these things. This is getting too far into the inner workings of the oil companies and not at the kind of level of discourse. So I don't think they find them particularly interesting. And then for historians of climate denialism and agnotology, I think these technologies, at least for the moment, present a little bit of an anomaly for the narrative that they want to tell, right? If you take these technologies seriously, then suddenly it becomes much less clear what oil companies should have been doing in the 1970s that they weren't actually doing, right? If you say, oh, they knew about climate change, then you say, well, that implies that they should have been preparing for an energy transition. Well, what would that have looked like? It would have implied very large programs in technologies with a much smaller carbon footprint, which happens to have actually been the case. Now, I think there's a way to interpret what was going on in a way that fits very nicely with the, Exxon knew, Shell knew, Total knew narrative. But that's not the way that that narrative has been presented so far. Unfortunately, I should say one more thing. To the extent that oil historians have noticed these other technologies, it's generally, they kind of explain it away by saying, well, this was a period when there was a fad in business culture for diversification of very large companies into markets unrelated to their core business, right? And it is certainly true that oil companies invested in some very strange things in this period: real estate, agriculture, pet food. Exxon owned a golf club manufacturer, right? Exxon bought up something like 20 computing and office information companies and tried to package them together into a office information suite. So, we could all have been using Exxon computers today if that had worked out. So they were highly diversified in this era. But that explanation only goes so far. It doesn't really tell us why they diversified in some directions and not others. And also, once you start to probe, it does seem as though there's a logic to some of these diversification choices that's based on something more than just a kind of management fad. Yeah. So because no one has been interested in these oil company alternative energy programs, right? Not the oil historians, not the intellectual historians, not the historians of science. That means that the only people who have anything substantial to say about them have been conspiracy theorists. So if you go on the internet, I don't know if I advise, but you will very, very quickly find all kinds of conspiracy theories that the oil companies were trying to hold back solar energy, they were trying to hold back nuclear energy. This idea has gone into academic culture and into popular culture to some extent. So, it forms one of the plot lines in David Mitchell's book and the movie Cloud Atlas. It forms one of the lines of argument in Timothy Mitchell's very influential book, Carbon Democracy, where Mitchell tries to claim that somehow the oil industry invented the concept of the environment and the environmental movement solely in order to hinder nuclear power so that the price of nuclear energy would always be higher than the price of energy from fossil fuels. I personally don't find this argument very convincing at all. And if you look at where Mitchell's sources are coming from at the point in his book where he makes this argument, it's very fishy. He doesn't really ground it in any empirical sources. But it is true that people at the time, many people at the time, influential people at the time thought this, right? So it was very easy to find people in the streets saying, yeah, solar will never take off, it's all for show. The oil companies are holding it back. We find politicians, in particular in the US, there was a senator, James Alvarez, who said, yeah, the oil companies are just trying to get a monopoly on alternative energy so that they can hold it back. And what we need to do is have legislation to break up the oil companies and force them to divest from their alternative energy programs. He got quite far with that, but the bill never passed because the oil companies fought him very, very hard to make sure that they could retain all of these alternative energy subsidiaries. Now, it's certainly the case that this is not a nice industry, right? They've fomented coups and wars. They've shown a great deal of negligence when it comes to environment and occupational safety. At the moment, they're, of course, trading the long-term future of our species for their short-term profits. So there's every reason to be suspicious of them. But if you start to drill into, the concrete motivations that would have to be at play for these conspiracy theories to be true, you start to find that it falls apart, right? So this is probably most obvious when it comes to nuclear energy. It turns out, and Michel Braun, a PhD candidate in managing scarcity, he's done incredible work on this, that the connections between nuclear physics and the oil industry go back to the 1920s. That oil firms were among the very first firms to take up the new quantum mechanics and to start to apply it in a way that would have some commercial relevance. Right? They were using radio instruments for detecting radioactivity in exploring for oil from very, very early on, which meant that they were among the only companies in the world that had real concrete experience with the new nuclear physics by the time World War II broke out. This meant that in the US atomic bomb program, the Manhattan Project, oil companies were all over the place, right? In popular culture, the Manhattan Project is often represented as, this kind of quirky band of physicists working out in the desert, academics thinking grand thoughts, but coming up with this incredible device, right? We're going to have a blockbuster movie about Robert Oppenheimer this summer, which basically makes this kind of argument. In fact, though, the Manhattan Project employed hundreds of thousands of people, and almost all of those people were employed by commercial contractors. Papendier, who's very prominent in French politics now, he's written a book about DuPont's involvement in the Manhattan Project, but it wasn't just DuPont. It was Kellex, it was Tennessee Eastman, it was Stone and Webster. It was lots and lots of firms, most of which had some connection either to petrochemical production or to oil exploration or to the construction of chemical plants and refineries, right? That's at the level of companies. At the level of individuals, many of the individuals who were in influential positions within the Manhattan Project came from the oil industry, especially on the kind of engineering, the chemical engineering side of things. And this is a giant plant owned by Kellex, so an oilfield services company that is enriching uranium for the Manhattan Project. So this is not a small level involvement. This was quite at a large scale. After the war, some of these companies that were involved in the Manhattan Project, they move out of nuclear technology, but lots of other oil companies start to move in. Now, in many countries that have a national oil company, that happens because that national oil company is ordered by the government to aid the growth of an indigenous nuclear industry. That's to some extent what happens in France and also in the Netherlands. Shell is not directly involved in the Netherlands' early forays into nuclear power, but indirectly it has lots and lots of influence, and it's feeding lots of expertise into that project. In the US, it's a little different. What happens is that the big oil companies, the ones that are operating internationally, especially the ones that have access to cheap Middle Eastern oil, they kind of say, well, nuclear, this is, we're not going to be able to make a profit on this. We're going to put all of our resources into building up production, especially in the Middle East. But it's the smaller companies that don't have access to cheap Middle Eastern oil that are saying, well, domestic US oil is becoming much more expensive relative to this cheap Middle Eastern oil. Our profits on domestic oil are becoming much thinner. So we need to diversify into other areas where we can take our oil expertise and apply it to mining of various minerals, uranium, but also things like vanadium. And also we need to move into new oil provinces within the US, So a good example here is a small company called Kerr-McGee, very politically connected. So the Kerr of Kerr-McGee is a U.S. senator from Oklahoma. But they're not one of the big companies. They can see that the profits on their domestic production are getting much more precarious. So in the 1950s, they diversify in a very big way. They really bet the company on moving into mining, coal mining, potash, vanadium, uranium. And then in the uranium side, they also move into uranium refining and processing, right? And they really start to look toward the civilian nuclear power market as the big market in which they're going to survive. They also, though, are among the very first firms to move offshore into the Gulf of Mexico. So here we return to this argument from oil history that this is all about diversification. Yes, it's partly about diversification. A company like Kerr-McGee diversifies very widely in the 1950s, but it's not because it's some management fad. It's because they're forced to, right? That their profits are getting thinner and thinner. And so if they want to survive, they need to move into new markets, new sources of oil, but also new minerals, and also into nuclear energy. Now, again, so the diversification argument needs to be nuanced. The conspiracy theory argument also needs to be nuanced. Yes, Kerr-McGee was involved in a conspiracy around nuclear energy. They were involved in conspiracy to retain their nuclear energy program. So in the early 1970s, there's a Kerr-McGee employee at one of their uranium refining plants, Karen Silkwood, who discovers that, Kerr-McGee's occupational safety practices are not very good. She and all of her colleagues are being exposed to quite substantial levels of radiation. She starts to collect evidence of this. She tells her union and the New York Times that she's going to, deliver a bundle of this evidence so that they can publicize what Kerr-McGee is doing. And as she's driving to meet a New York Times reporter, her car is mysteriously pushed off the road and she dies. And the bundle of evidence that she had with her mysteriously disappears. No one's ever exactly solved the case, but it seems fairly clear that Kerr-McGee, at the very least, was trying to threaten her, if not outright, remove her, the threat that she posed. So clearly there was some sort of conspiracy going on, but it was a conspiracy designed to allow Kerr-McGee to remain in the nuclear business. It was not a conspiracy designed to hinder the nuclear business. One of the weird things here is that in David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas book, this exact storyline gets taken up, but the whistleblower in his book is someone who's trying to show that the oil firms are trying to hold back the nuclear industry. So he takes the conspiracy theory, but he turns it exactly on its head. Now, so as I said, Kerr-McGee, it's sort of representative of small US oil companies. If I go back to this table, what you see at the top, the companies in bold are companies that other smaller companies have been merged into over the years. So, or I should say, sort of the ones to the left are in that category, right? So firms like Exxon, Shell, BP, Chevron, Amy. Those bigger firms in the early post-war era, they're not very interested in nuclear technology. They're not very interested in diversifying into other markets. It's these smaller firms, the ones further to the right, that get into nuclear technology in the immediate post-war years. But by the late 1960s, that starts to change. Nuclear oil companies start to buy up or to form nuclear units, also solar and geothermal units. They start to talk much more about an impending energy crisis, oil crisis, they start to raise the alarm that, yeah, the cost of oil is going to get much higher in coming years. And this has a lot to do with Hubbert's peak, this idea that if you have a resource that you are extracting, you will eventually hit some peak of production of that resource, after which it becomes more and more expensive to get that resource out of the ground, and so production will start to go down. King Hubbert is a geophysicist at Shell. He proposes this idea in the 1950s. Basically, he's laughed out of town by his colleagues in the oil industry at the time. They say, no, oil will go on basically forever. The reserves are much, much larger than you think they are. We can't start talking about peak production at the moment. He's forced to move to the US Geological Survey. His colleagues there, influenced by the oil industry, they put limits on what he can say publicly, so he really can't talk about peak oil. And they put out their own estimates that are wildly optimistic and very much in line with the oil industry's estimates. Then by the late 1960s, yeah, production of oil in the US starts to slow down. And by 1970, it actually hits a peak. Suddenly all of these big oil companies, they can see that, well, we're not going to be able to raise production in the US anymore, right? We're stuck with an actually declining level of production. What does this mean? Yeah. This means that it makes it much harder for them to deal with the host countries where they're operating internationally, right? So throughout its history, the international oil industry has faced threats from host countries that their assets would be nationalized. Occasionally that has happened, so Mexico in the late 1930s. More often in the first part of the 20th century, those efforts were turned back. So in places like Venezuela in the 40s or Iran in the 50s. Because the oil industry could always say, yeah, we can ramp up production to compensate for the loss of assets in any host country, therefore that host country will lose out, and their threat of nationalization is an empty threat. By the late 1960s, though, those host countries through OPEC are coordinating much more efficiently. They're able to drive much harder bargains and to get much better concessions from the oil companies. And that becomes a permanent feature of the oil industry because they can no longer ramp up production elsewhere, right? So it's no longer an empty threat. What this means is that, especially after the 1973 Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries embargo, it means that the oil industry starts to say, if we want to continued economic growth, that requires growth in energy production. If we want growth in energy production, though, either we have to become much more dependent on Middle Eastern oil and oil from countries that can deploy the oil bomb, or we need to develop alternative sources of energy. So those alternative sources could be ways of stretching out the fossil fuels not located in OPEC countries. So you see a lot of oil executives in this period talking about, well, we need more conservation programs. We need permissions to move into new oil provinces in Alaska and in the North Sea. We, as the price of oil goes up, we can undertake programs to get oil out of tight formations of rock that would normally be too technologically intensive and too expensive to exploit. So things like oil shale and what today we would call fracking, tar sands, these very kind of exotic forms of fossil fuels. But then they also say, we're going to need something apart from fossil fuels. And the general line you see from the oil industry in this period is in the short to medium term, that's going to have to be nuclear power. But in the very long term, by which they meant our present, it's going to have to be something renewable, solar, wind, fusion energy. So this is a period when all of these oil companies, they start to get into solar power in a very big way, and they start, in fact, to use solar power in their own oil production processes. Okay, let's see. Yeah, and this is also the period when they get into all of these other technologies that I've talked about, where they start or they own nuclear fission and fusion programs. They start exploiting geothermal fields in a big way. They start buying up seed companies and biotech companies and forests, in fact, with the idea of developing biomass as a fuel, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in managing scarcity, about half of the project, so the 2 PhDs plus sort of half of the postdoc's time, is really dedicated to looking at these technologies that were presented as a way to address the energy crises of the early 1970s, well, throughout the 1970s. But then in the other arm of the project, we look at the kind of larger discussions, institution building, discourse around scarcity more generally in this period, and to try and understand what was the role of oil actors, usually individual oil actors, but to some extent companies, in that debate, and also how that debate then relates to these technological efforts in alternative energy and other technologies. So this was, of course, a period when talk about scarcity was quite widespread. It was a neo-Malthusian moment, right? That discussion doesn't really start with oil. Starts more with a kind of discussion about the scarcity of things like water, clean water and clean air. Starts with, or connects to much older discourses about overpopulation and food scarcity. But very quickly, people start to see that this isn't these questions aren't just about sort of perils of industrialization in general, the perils of a kind of extractive economy that produces all sorts of externalities in general. But then, in fact, this is a discussion where the oil industry and the petrochemical industry have a very, very prominent central place, right? So what are the things that are scarce in this period? Well, it's clean water, because there are all sorts of runoff from petrochemical plants and from oil spills that are making clean water scarce. It's about scarcity of clean air, because the air is filled with smog from burning gasoline for cars, right? So even before 1970, this neo-Malthusian discussion starts to notice that the oil and petrochemical industries have a central place in any discussion of scarcity. After 1973, that's even more the case. Suddenly it becomes clear to everyone that oil is the resource that is scarce, and its scarcity has all kinds of ramifications for every corner of the economy. Yeah. Okay. Well, it turns out that this conversation wasn't just about the oil industry was also a conversation in which people from the oil industry were playing a prominent role. So in managing scarcity, we place the two people at the top, Robert O. Anderson, the co-founder and head of Atlantic Richfield, kind of mid-size US oil company that's now part of BP, and Maurice Strong, best known as a Canadian diplomat and prominent figure at the United Nations, but an oil executive before he went to the UN and after he went to the UN. So we look at Anderson and Strong, their collaborations with each other, and also a kind of wider circle that they built that included a number of other people who had some sort of tie to the oil industry. That includes King Hubbard. Thornton Bradshaw was the president of Atlantic Richfield under Robert Anderson, but he was also, Anderson brought into a lot of this kind of international diplomacy and institution building. Joseph Slater was the head of the Aspen Institute. So Anderson had become involved with the Aspen Institute in the 1950s. Aspen at that time was a very strange organization that would bring executives from various companies in for these kind of week-long intensive seminars where they would be exposed to the humanities. They would learn about how to be humanistic businessmen. Anderson takes control of the Aspen Institute in the late 50s. He runs it for 30 years, and he retains this kind of strange executive training side, but he also then expands it into a place where internationally important conferences bringing together elite figures would be held, and also a research institute that would undertake its own research and also sponsor external research across a wide variety of topic areas, international relations, nuclear weapons and disarmament, but quite prominent, especially in the 1970s. There's a research program in climate change and food security in the face of climate change. And so Slater is sort of Anderson's right-hand man at Aspen. He's also a former oil executive. George McGee is a geophysicist. He's in an oil company. Then he goes to work for the US State Department. He becomes US ambassador to Turkey and then to Germany. So fairly influential diplomat. But he's also on the board both of the Aspen Institute and of Mobil Oil. So another character linking together this circle to the oil industry. And then finally, George Mitchell is a Houston real estate and natural gas developer. He's known today as the father of fracking. He's the person who really figured out how to make hydraulic fracking a profitable technique for exploiting natural gas. But he becomes part of this circle in the 1970s. He holds a series of conferences on limits to growth and alternatives to growth. He has lots of interchanges with the Aspen Institute. He becomes a big sponsor of sort of futurist studies of how the world should respond to climate change and food insecurity. So there's quite a tight-knit circle around all of these people who have some connection to the oil industry. But then Anderson and Strong, with these various oil allies, they also then bring in lots and lots of other institutions which are better remembered today and even more prominent at the time, or that are not seen as connected to oil, but through Anderson and Strong, the interests of the oil industry, or at least their corner of the oil industry, are represented in those institutions. So in particular, in the run-up to the United Nations 1972 Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment, Strong is the Secretary General of that conference. Strong and Anderson agree that Anderson will found a think tank called the International Institute for Environmental Affairs. And Anderson sends one of his staffers from the Aspen Institute to work first for this IIEA and then for Strong himself in the organizing of the Stockholm Conference. This IIEA becomes the think tank that produces the core text for the Stockholm Conference called Only One Earth. At the Stockholm Conference itself, Only One Earth is a little bit overshadowed by the Limits to Growth report, which is released just a few weeks before the meeting. But in fact, Anderson and Strong are fine with that because they're already in dialogue with the Club of Rome, which has sponsored the Limits to Growth report. And then after the Stockholm meeting, they bring one of the founders of the Club of Rome, Aurelio Pichet, they bring him in as a board member of this IIEA. They change its name to the IIED, International Institute for Environment and Development. They, together with the Club of Rome and the Nobel Foundation, they found something called the International Federation of Institutes of Advanced Study, which sponsors lots of environmental research and climate change research. It's one of the launching pads for the career of Amory Lovins, very prominent environmentalist. Strong himself becomes the first director of the United Nations Environment Program. And from that, he's always the key figure who's brought in whenever the UN has a big environmental initiative. So he's a member, and I think he plays an important role in the staffing of the Brundtland Commission in the middle of the 1980s, which really puts this idea of sustainable development on the international agenda. He plays more or less the same role for the 1992 Rio summit that he played in the 1972 Stockholm meeting. And out of Rio, he ensures that there will be all of these climate conventions that, have continued right up to the present day. So Strong and Anderson, they're incredibly influential figures in this period of the 1970s. They're everywhere. Anderson is a little bit behind the scenes. He doesn't want to be noticed too visibly himself, but Strong is, he has friends in every government on Earth. He's a very well-known figure. Their influence is felt right to the present in the institutions that they brought into being or helped bring into being in this period. But of course, this connection between oil and environmental governance that they forged in the 1970s has more or less disappeared, right? Or at least it's kind of turned in the opposite direction from the form that they promoted back in that era. Now, why is that? Well, it's not for lack of trying. So Strong and Anderson, all through their papers, you can see them asking their colleagues in the oil industry for funding for all of these kinds of initiatives. And they're somewhat successful. Lots of the big oil companies give money to the Aspen Institute, to this international federation. They're sponsoring all of these discussions about climate change and environmentalism. They're willing to put money into this in the 1970s. Maybe they're not backing this program to the same extent as Anderson and Strong are, but they're not opposing it by any means, right? They want a seat at the table in these discussions. Anderson and Strong and their allies, they're very keen to make sure that a wide range of opinions are represented in these discussions, and they want to make sure that the oil industry is among the voices that are in these discussions. So this is a quote. This is an extract from a report by a CIA monitor who went to one of these limits to growth conferences that Mitchell put on, where he says, people from both sides of this issue, people who say that resources are scarce, people who say that resources are infinite, they were both represented there. There was a vigorous debate. People had very varying opinions about some of these characters in particular. At my table, people had very differing opinions about Herman Kahn, this techno-optimist and futurist. Some of them saying, yeah, he's obscene, he's crazy. Others saying he's the only one talking sense. And naturally, it was the oil, people from the oil industry at my table who thought that Kahn was the one making the most sense, right? So Strong and Anderson, they want the oil industry to be involved in this discussion. They want the oil industry to be exposed to the full range of opinions about climate change, about scarcity, about environmentalism. I think their minds are fairly open as to what the solutions should be to these problems, and they want this discussion to move toward positions that can acquire some kind of consensus. And in the 70s, the oil industry is willing to play the game. That then starts to change in the 1980s, and it changes largely because the price of oil really turns around, right? So the price of oil has this big leap in 73, 74. It has another big leap in 78, 79 with the Iranian Revolution. And then the price of oil starts to decline, at first a little bit slowly and then very rapidly. And as that happens, the oil industry loses interest in this scarcity debate. It loses interest in participating in Anderson and Strong's network. The network really falls apart. Some of the institutions continue on, but they no longer have this connection to oil. At the same time, the oil industry largely gets out of the technologies that I've talked about. So they sell off most of their solar programs, most of their nuclear programs. They unwind their investments in geothermal and biotech. They're no longer seeing these non-oil technologies as the key to their long-range future. They go into the 1980s as diversified energy companies. They leave the 1980s as oil companies. Now, why does that happen? Well, it's partly because as the price of oil goes down, the profits decline very rapidly. They have to sell off a lot of their assets. They sell off all of these investments in long-range technologies, of course, but they also sell off a lot of their core assets too. They're just getting rid of everything. At the same time, it becomes cheaper to buy another company's oil reserves than to go looking for your own new reserves. So there's a wave of hostile takeover attempts in the oil industry in this period. So this is, I mean, it's kind of unclear, but it's showing hostile takeover attempts between oil companies over the course of the 1980s. So all of these companies are hoarding cash either to defend against another company's hostile takeover attempt or to make their own hostile takeover bids so that they can acquire other companies' oil reserves. They're also, in the face of hostile takeover bids, having to convince their shareholders that these companies are going to focus on short-term returns on investment instead of investing for the long term, right? So that means getting out of things like solar technology, which they all say, well, yeah, that won't be ready until the early 2000s, and instead focusing on getting oil out of the ground now. So in managing scarcity, we want to argue that this really creates the conditions for climate denialism, right? Climate science is an existential threat to an oil company, but it's not an existential threat to a diversified energy company, because those diversified energy company can say, yeah, we're in fossil fuels now, but we have a plan, we've made the investments to move into nuclear in the short term and into solar and fusion in the longer term. But if you're only doing oil, you really can't make that argument anymore. So what do you have to do instead? You have to show that actually climate change isn't a threat and nothing needs to be done about it, and we can go on producing and consuming fossil fuels forever. Final and somewhat more speculative argument I want to make is that the climate denialist networks that emerged in the late 1980s and in the early 1990s were composed of people who had been at the margins of Anderson and Strong's network in the 1970s. So Anderson and Strong and their allies, because they were committed to informing everyone and having lots of voices represented in this conversation, they were constantly inviting people who were climate minimizers or techno-optimists into their conferences. They were constantly sending reports about their conferences to people who later on would become climate denialists. So all of the kind of most prominent climate denialists who get going in the late 1980s had some connection to what Anderson and Strong were doing in the 1970s. Some of them quite close connections. So for instance, Fritz Bircher, the Dutch climate denialist, who in the 1990s Shell and lots of other Dutch companies are giving him lots of money to go out and to show that climate change is nothing to be worried about, that the Gaia principle will ensure that the ecosystem rebalances, and so we can make as much carbon dioxide as we want because it'll never matter. Bircher in the 70s is a member of the Club of Rome, and so he's very central to these conversations that Strong and Anderson are putting together. Okay, so what does all this mean? So I guess I would take two big arguments out of this. One is that the knowing of climate change that people are pointing to in the 1970s is the flip side of the coin of the agnotology and denialism of the 1990s, that the two are entangled with each other, that we can't entirely separate out the knowing and the attention that the oil industry was bringing to climate change in the 1970s. We can't separate it out from the denialism that they're engaging in the 1990s. These are continuous activities in some sense. In some ways, the way I would put it is that climate denialism doesn't represent so much a response to climate activism in the 1970s, but even in some ways a split within that movement, within the movement that Anderson and Strong were leaders in. And then the other thing I would say is that this narrative doesn't absolve the oil industry of any guilt. It maybe complicates some of our narratives about the oil industry, but certainly we can see that they made some sort of turn away from a more sustainable path toward a denialist path. But this narrative that I've presented, it shines a light on other actors who also need to shoulder some of the blame. In particular, neoliberal politicians and financiers of the 1970s who encouraged short-term thinking and a much stronger focus on shareholders' return on investment and a much a retreat from investing in long-term speculative technologies needed for an eventual energy transition. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Cyrus, for your very inspiring talk. I want to thank Jean-Baptiste Fressoz for accepting to be the student of your talk. I think that everyone here knows Jean-Baptiste. If not, he's the perfect person. After listening to your talk, he's really the perfect person to be the student because he works on several topics you mentioned with very well-known books here. And if someone here does not know Jean-Baptiste, please let me know after, because you should read him, of course.
Well, thanks, Cyrus. It was very interesting. I think your explanation of the shift from Exxon and other companies being interested in climate change to Exxon being climato-skeptic is very convincing. It's the best explanation, but it's a mystery for me. Okay, I never understood why. In 1977, Exxon is financing and they're publishing good articles on climate change. They work with serious climatologists, and suddenly in the 90s it completely changes. So I think it's a very interesting explanation, and I had never heard it. So I was really impressed by that. I think one of the most interesting points for me in your paper, it shows, even if you talk about an oil company, this is an abstraction. Sometimes you shouldn't use this word because it's much more complex. I mean, what you, in a way, explain reminds me of the history of Standard Oil. You know, Standard Oil is an oil company. No, it owns hundreds of different companies. Standard Oil owned the biggest barrel manufacturers at that time because they need to store oil, and they produce more barrels than all London in the 1900s. They own enormous amount of forest area. They own enormous amount of coal mines because, of course, they need all these materials. So in a way, I mean, this is, for me, I mean, this is really a key point in the historiography that we tend to brandish, you know, it's an oil company, it's a coal company. No, in fact, these companies are much more complex than that. So this is a good example of this important point. So, I mean, what you say about this diversification in the 70s and the 80s is extremely interesting, and especially in the solar I didn't know that. I was a bit surprised that you didn't talk about coal, because perhaps it's a bit of a problem in your argument, I don't know. But by far the most important investments by the oil company in the energy, other energy than oil, is in coal, by far. I mean, it's much more important than uranium, much more important than fission or fusion or solar or anything you want. It's coal. Which means that, you know, the issue of being diversified for environmental reasons and so on, I'm not really convinced, because otherwise they wouldn't invest so much in coal. And even more so that actually in the late 70s, and early 80s, when the issue of climate change starts to rise in the US sphere, US public sphere, at the Senate they start to have audition on climate change as soon as 79, it's earlier in Europe. At that point, oil is not the issue, because everybody thinks that oil is finished. It's a dying sector, right? I'm more lobbying is clear on that. The issue is not oil. Okay? So the key debate is about coal. It's really coal that is the issue of climate change. And they're right in a way, there's so much more carbon in coal than in oil. And all the climatologists say that. I mean, oil is not a problem, the problem is coal. And the key technology that is starting the debate is synfuels. Synfuels is to transform coal into oil, okay, with chemical engineering. And the big investor in this domain are the oil companies, Exxon, right? Exxon goes to South Africa to learn about Sasol, who is the world leader in artificial oil production. So, and they are defending this technology. They are not, you know, shy on that. They say you should go for it. The Carter administration defends this project, and Jimmy Carter creates a company called the Synfuel Company, which is going to invest $80 billion in the liquefaction of oil, and Exxon is ravished about that, because it's going to be public money to for their industries. So, I mean, this diversification move, you know, it goes everywhere. I think there is a very important guide that helps us understand what's happening, not to the oil company, but at what, because I don't know, there are so many different oil companies that many different leaders, like Maurice Strong is different from others leaders, but it's Edward Davids. Davids is the head of the research and development branch of Exxon. He was responsible for the Bell Labs in the 60s. He was then the science advisor of Nixon, really important character. And I think this is, I mean, it helps understand what is happening in a way, I think, in the mind of not the oil company, I shouldn't use this word, but in '82 he works with Jim Hansen on climate change. He gives a talk to a whole group of climatologists, and he says, you know, we know there is an energy transition, and Exxon is working for the energy transition, and I guess he has in mind perhaps all this diversification that you are mentioning. And he says, you know, it takes 50 years to have an energy transition. It's based on innovation, it is based on technologies, and Exxon, of course, is the leader for that, right? So you should let us do, basically. And this is really an argument for the free market and innovation to solve the climate issue. So this is in October '82. He's at this climatology conference organized by Jim Hansen. All the climatologists buy the argument, saying it takes 50 years to make an energy transition, and you know, the climate catastrophe will probably arrive later than the energy transition. So they have no idea about what is actually a real energy transition. But David knows what it is, and he knows that all the gadgets, the solar, even the nuclear, is not at scale. And 3 months later, it's in China, where there is an international conference. I mean, the US at that point is trying to cooperate with the Chinese government on energy issues, and so it is an official conference. So it's in November '82, a few weeks later, is in Beijing. The first talk is given by a climatologist. There is an issue of climate change, he shows the killing curve and so on. And Edward David says, you know, the talk is about the uncertainty in the energy market. He said there's one thing certain, fossil fuels are here for the 21st century. And the major energy in the future is going to be coal. So I think, you know, all this diversification trend is not really at scale with the issue of climate change, and the people like Edward David knew that, you know, it's not a technology issue. It's much deeper than that. We could have, you know, massive expansion of the nuclear program in the US. We don't change anything about the climate. And there were clear energy modeling showing that in the late 70s and early 80s. Climate change is a civilizational issue. It's completely inexorable, that we are bound to have doubling of the CO2 in the atmosphere. There's no way to prevent that. Even the US, at that point, you know, they received in 79, there's a local report, an international report on coal. And the Chinese are saying we plan to have 2 gigatons of coal by 1980, which is more or less the amount of coal in the world at the time. So they all know that it's going to rise. So I think it's something that we need to have in mind when we have this vision of, you know, there is oil company versus solar company. No, I mean, this is really a kind of gigantomachy of ideas. They are really abstract ideas, and the key thing is people at the Exxon knew that. They had the model. So coal, I think, should be in your story. And the other thing that should be in your story is, I mean, so you, of course, you centered on the oil industry, but I have more focused on the sources from the Atomic Energy Commission. And I think they're very important in some of the characters that you mentioned. For instance, King Hubbard, okay, he's employed by Shell, sure. But in 1955, he's recruited as a consultant for the Atomic Energy Commission, and then he's working for the Atomic Energy Commission. I mean, if you read his papers on the peak oil, I mean, the shape of the peak, where does it come from? It comes from a fantastic graphic innovation of showing the history of the humanity over 10,000 years. And over 10,000 years, as perceptions are very, very big. And you contrast that with the amount of energy that you could reach if you've got a breeder reactor, which is really the fantasy of these people at that time. And then you got an infinite plateau of energy going to the year 2000, 10,000. So, and then King Hubbard is several times auditioned by the Senate and by the Joint Committee, which supervised the Atomic Energy Commission, and is really a major actor in the lobbying of the Atomic Energy Commission. In 1965, before I can remember, there is a report by the ABC to John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and it is penned by King Hubbard on the theory that yes, you need to finance a breeder reactor because we're going to have oil scarcity and so on and so forth. So this idea of energy crisis, of energy scarcity, is really clearly connected to the Atomic Energy Commission lobbying. Actually, I really looked at the first occurrences of this idea of energy crisis. It starts much before the oil shock, 1968. And it is in the great literature of the Atomic Energy Commission. They start to, you know, diffuse this idea that we're going to have nitrogen trap if we go on. And actually, at the beginning, it's not about oil, it's gas and coal. In 1965, there's a big blackout in New York City, and they say, I mean, everybody knows why the blackout is not linked with the scarcity of coal at all. There's plenty of coal in the US, but the US Atomic Energy Commission tries to diffuse this idea that, you know, we are really reaching like the beginning of exhaustion, and there are advertisements in all the press by General Electric for the breeder reactor, putting forward this idea that coal is becoming extinct. So I think that, you know, I have no doubt that, you know, oil is really a central issue, character, but I think the atomic energy, as in terms of concept, of imaginaries, in framing the debate, has also been very, very influential. and it should be in history. Last thing I wanted to talk about the multi-level perspective, because in fact I will start with that. I will be much more severe against this perspective. I think it is, but we haven't talked about it, so perhaps we won't talk about it right now, but I think it's dishonest, it's misleading, and the scandal.
Historical.
In terms of history, it's just very wrong. It's a very cliche history, a very bad history of tech. With this idea that there was a ship on sail from steamships in the 19th century, all this kind of rubbish stuff. And far more sailing ships than steamships nowadays, actually. This is just really bad history. And then it is connected with theories of technological change, which are more interesting. But then the problem is that it's at the, they try to put themselves at the center of conversation on climate change. And I think this is really a problem, a serious problem. If you look at the last IPCC report, Group 3, the only place where history intervenes in the report is when they talk about this Frank Hill's Benjamin Sovacool and so on. Yeah. And they say, oh yes, energy transition can go fast. Look at Benjamin Sovacool article. Gosh. Because he studies a few examples of fast diffusion of technology. It has nothing to do with the issue of climate change. So, I mean, I will be more quick on that than you. And the problem is because they are focused on innovation and technologies. And they don't look at raw materials. Yeah. And that's really the main point. And I just want to finish on one quote, which I find important and deep to reflect on this issue. It's a quote by a 1928 US forester. People at that time are worried about the future of timber. You know, skyscrapers are growing mushrooms and they're made of cement and steel, so are they going to be needs of food? And the guy said, you know, raw materials are never obsolete. And I think people at the oil industry knew that. They knew that, you know, there is a really like oil. You will need oil in the world in the year 2050, 2060. I mean, and solar energy is not going to crowd out or get rid of oil like this. I mean, they were quite confident, I think, in the importance of their
Okay. Just a few words. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't disagree with anything you've said. These are great points. I'll make a little bit of special pleading on coal, which is that, you know, when I put together the project many years ago now, coal wasn't really on my radar because I hadn't gotten into the project yet. So the way I structured the project was that, well, we'll have someone doing nuclear, so that PhD candidate I think will tackle a lot of the things that you're talking about with the Atomic Energy Commission. We'll have one looking at solar, and then the postdoc and I will the Anderson Strong Circle and those kinds of things. As we've gotten further and further into it, coal has become it's become much more obvious that coal is really important here. But I think we do have one way of talking about coal, or one place to insert coal in the conversation, and that's around this character, Carol Wilson, that we were talking about beforehand. So Wilson is, he's a very interesting guy. He's a physicist. He's the first managing director of the Atomic Energy Commission in the US. He goes to MIT. He becomes a founding member of the Club of Rome. In fact, he's on the Club of Rome's executive committee for several years until he figures out that actually the executive committee doesn't do anything. It's just a related to chase. So he resigns from that. But he's the one who puts the Club of Rome in contact with the people who write the Limits to Growth report. He's buddies with Anderson. He gets to know Strong eventually. He knows McGee from way back. So he's very tightly connected with this group, and I think he's the one who forms the main bridge between this group and the Club of Rome.
He's at the MIT.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so in the 70s, he does this alternative energy strategies workshop, which brings in lots of these people to really try and figure out which are the alternative energies that are going to be most important in the medium and longer term. And then, that project morphs into something called the World Coal Report. And the bridge there is, Wilson says, look, we need to eventually transition to an energy and mix energy mix in which renewables play a much bigger role, but that's not going to happen for a very long time. So we need a bridge in between. What are the energy technologies that are going to be in that bridge? Well, the only viable alternatives are nuclear and coal. But we know that nuclear is a non-starter because of environmental concerns, right?
And also bad choices, bad technology
Yeah,
choices.
yeah,
And insist on the fact that they basically were just a bigger submarine reactor, and it's very stable, and it's very critical of himself, actually, of what the ANC choices have been doing in 46, 47.
Yeah, yeah. So there's some turn, right? So yeah, it's definitely the case that in the 60s and in the early 70s, all of these oil executives are saying, no, we know nuclear will be dominant in just a few years, right? And then by the end of the 1970s, they start to say, well, places where they make the right choices, like France, nuclear can take off, but here in the US, Hollywood types have gotten in the way, and nuclear can't expand. Therefore, it's going to have to be coal. So yeah, you're definitely right. The coal is the medium-term technology that they're looking to turn into an oil technology, right? They're looking for ways to pipeline coal to make synfuels. They also talk about it very much in relationship to other type formations of fossil fuels. One kind of sequel to that is that, yeah, Exxon is very heavy into synfuels. They collaborate with this government synfuels corporation. Then when Reagan comes in, the synfuels corporation is dissolved, and suddenly Exxon and all these other companies, they trumpet this neoliberal line that the synfuels corporation is the paradigmatic example of government overreach, right? And it shows that, full stop, that government can't ever be involved in markets, that they're too stupid to know what they're doing. So it's another one of these places where in the 80s there's a kind of